Well, good morning. My name is Mike Bryan. I'm a volunteer with the Southern Arizona VA, working on the Veterans History Project. Today's date is Tuesday, September 13th, 2016, and we're at the home of Colonel Bill Pitts, who served in Vietnam, later in Desert Storm.
Desert Shield.
Desert Shield, okay. And I've read his story, and he's listed in the Friday Pilots and has a very intriguing story that I'm anxious to hear more about today. So, Bill, why don't you give me your full name and your birth date?
My name is Charles William Pitts. I go by Bill. My birth date is 22 August 1946.
1946. All right. Well, why don't we just jump in? There was, before you were in the military, it really wasn't on your radar, apparently. Tell us a little bit about how that unfolded.
No, it wasn't on my radar at all, but Vietnam was going on, obviously, and I had grown up in a rural town, Alexander City, Alabama, a town of about 12,000. It was a cotton mill town. Mm-hmm. And I think I always had decided that I wanted to go to college, and I'm not sure why. None of my sisters had, and my parents didn't, but I wanted to. I guess I ran with the right crowd, and was pretty well determined that since I'd only been to 2 or 3 states in my life, that I was going to stay in Alabama. So I was planning on going to either Auburn or Alabama. Hadn't decided. Came home one day, and my parents were just happy as they could be because they'd just gotten a letter from a congressman or senator appointing me as a first alternate to the Air Force Academy. And I said, how could that be? Because I never applied to the Air Force Academy. And they said, well, we got Judge Coley to contact his good buddy, the senator, and now you have a first alternate appointment. I had no interest whatsoever in going to the Air Force Academy. I don't know why. I just wasn't part of me. And as it turns out, the primary went to the academy, and I didn't. And I ended up going to Auburn University.
Okay.
So that's how I ended up in college. Still no interest in the military, except that because of my appointment to the academy, I now managed to easily get into the Air Force ROTC program at Auburn. Auburn being a land grant school, it was mandatory that you did ROTC. So I was now in the Air Force program instead of the Army program, which made me happy. And I took a test. I took the Air Force Officer Qualification Test in my second year at Auburn, and apparently I scored high on it. And Sergeant McGrath, I still remember his name, came in one day and said, Cadet Pitts, I have the test results from your AFOQT. You scored really high on the aviation portion of the test. Any interest in being a pilot? And I said, well, I've never thought about it before, never touched an airplane in my life, but it sounds like fun, so why not? And that sort of got me off and running toward being an Air Force officer.
That's interesting because there's so many guys that just climbed over whatever obstacles they saw just to be a pilot, and it just kind of fell in your lap.
It really did. As most kids who go off to college, I had no clue who I wanted to be in life. Mm-hmm. But I had decided at some point that I would try dentistry. So I registered at Auburn in the pre-dentistry program, but I immediately took a chemistry course, the first of maybe 8 or 9 like courses in that curriculum, and I did very poorly in chemistry. and this was the easy part of the program. And I decided that quarter that I was not going to be a dentist. So I went and changed curriculum and got into business administration, which meant I had no idea who I wanted to be. And so I said in the chapter that Vietnam was my destiny, that as a result of me scoring high on that test and entering the flight program at Auburn, and then heading off to the Air Force. Had Vietnam not been going on, I have no idea who I would have ended up being, but I got to be who God intended for me to be because I enjoyed every bit of my Air Force career in being a pilot.
It was a hand-in-glove fit.
Absolutely. Perfect.
Well, talk about when you went to Vietnam, how you ended up there in the early part of your deployment.
My pilot training class, back in those days, the washout rate in pilot training was pretty excessive. I think we lost 43% of our class due to any number of things. Some self-initiated elimination. Some just couldn't hack the program. Some hated flying. There wasn't a good pre-program for pilot training, so a lot of people just didn't make it. So we lost quite a number. I ended up in the top 8 or 9. I don't remember exactly where, but I knew that we would only get 1 or 2 fighters, and I knew that a couple of the guys ahead of me wanted them. So I had decided that what I wanted to do was fly the OV-10 Bronco, which was a fairly new airplane at the time, and I wanted to go to Vietnam. And I can't tell you why. I had lost a couple of friends from high school already in Vietnam. Maybe that had something to do with it, but I wanted to do that. So I fought really hard to get my first choice, which was the OV-10, and that's what I got.
Tell me a little bit about that OV-10. What's it like, and what's it like to fly, and what's the purpose or the mission of that airplane?
Well, let me ask you a question. I've got a model over here that's a perfect replica.
Yeah.
Can I bring it over to you?
Absolutely.
I'll bring my favorite airplane over to, but this is the OV-10 Bronco. My son had this model made for me, and it's an exact replica of the airplane I flew in Vietnam, including he did the research and found the tail number of the first OV-10 that I flew, and this is the tail number that I flew. So this is the airplane that I flew in Vietnam.
Is that the Warthog?
No.
No. Okay.
This is the Warthog.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about that in a
Yeah,
little
in a
while.
little bit. Yeah. Well, why? No, why? So why were you attracted to this particular airplane? Do you think?
I had a cousin who had flown in Vietnam, and he had been there a couple of years ahead of me, and he flew the O-1 Bird Dog, and he was a forward air controller, and I'd heard some stories about what he did over there, and it was exciting. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I just had a fascination with that mission, the forward air controller mission.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that would be a fun thing to do. I didn't know at the time how dangerous it was. In fact, they've done a special on the History Channel, the military channel, and they call it the suicide mission, being a forward air controller in Vietnam.
Good thing you didn't know that.
Good thing I didn't know that, yeah. But I would have gone anyway.
Mm-hmm. So that was the aircraft that you wanted, and when you got into Vietnam, it sort of unfolded that you got that.
I graduated from pilot training. I graduated high enough in my class to get my first choice of assignment, which was this airplane. I went to Hurlburt Field in Florida, checked out in the OV-10, and after survival schools, I then headed off to Vietnam, where I was then assigned to the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron at NKP, Thailand.
Now, can you talk a little bit about the features of that aircraft?
Sure. It's a twin-engine turboprop. It was built by Fairchild Republic. specifically for Vietnam. It was built as a forward air control airplane. You can see here replicas of the rocket pods that we carried on the airplane. Each carried seven rockets, forward-firing rockets. These are little mini guns. These are machine guns. It's a 7.62 .308 caliber, fired about 2,000 rounds a minute with 4 guns, 2 on each side. We weren't allowed to use those guns except in emergency situations because most of the places that we flew were pretty high threat. Again, it's twin-engine turboprop, fully aerobatic.
What does that mean, aerobatic?
Well, it can do loops and aileron rolls and barrel rolls and Immelmans and all of the things that you can do in an aerobatic airplane. Some airplanes aren't stressed for that, but the OV-10 was.
Now, the mission of that was to ground support?
Yes, it was. My job was to go out every day over a designated area, and I actually flew in Laos the entire year, to go out every day and look for targets of opportunity. Sometimes we had predetermined targets, and we would have missions that were pre-planned, and we were to be on station for those fighters to come in to hit a pre-planned target, and we were there to mark the target with these white phosphorus rockets that we fired. The white phosphorus rockets, when they hit the ground, exploded, and they put out a huge plume of brilliantly white smoke. So it was easy to see from quite a distance away. So I would be flying over the target. The fighters would come in. I would have the target in sight. I would roll in and mark the target and tell them, okay, my smoke is 50 meters south. I want you to drop your bombs 50 meters north of my smoke. And that's how we identified where they were to put their bombs or their bullets.
Okay. And you're taking fire probably during a lot of this time then?
We tended to get shot at every day, because they knew that we were out there every day, all night, and we were looking for them. So they fired at us even when the weather was bad. We would see tracers or airbursts on virtually every mission, even with bad weather. If we were flying over the clouds, every now and then you'd see just airburst above you or around you because they were shooting at noise.
So, but you were based, as it turned out, in Thailand?
I started out Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, better known as NKP. It was a great place to be, rather than any of the bases in Vietnam. I was there a total of about 5.5 months, but during my tour there was a campaign called Lam Son 719, which was the South Vietnamese invasion of Laos, which was a disaster. And during that period, it was about a 2-month campaign, and I was sent to Quang Tri, South Vietnam, and we lived in plywood, what I'll call hooches, big enough for about 8 people. We had 16 living there. We double bunked because we had guys who flew nights and guys who flew days, and we flew every day, and it was quite an operation. And I tell a few stories in the book about Lam Son 719.
Well, why don't you tell us a story about it? Let's start with day 1 or day 3.
Oh yeah, okay.
Okay, you were.
That's my my introduction to the war. Okay, I'm 24 years old, I think. Never been. I've been to Alabama, Mississippi, and maybe North Florida in my life, and now I'm in Vietnam. So the first thing they do is they put you through theater indoctrination program, and so we're in classes and being told what this is all about, where we are, what to look for, what to do, how to be safe, all those kinds of things. And this class goes on for about 5 days before we ever are allowed to go out and actually touch an airplane. So we're in day 3, and we're in the middle of an intelligence briefing that's classified, and all of a sudden the speaker system came on in the building, and the speaker is reporting a downed airplane. A Raven FAC had been shot down in northern Laos, and we could hear the airplanes above him talking. So there was another Raven on site that had found the crash site and was overhead talking to the guy on the ground. He was still alive in his airplane. He was shot down in an O-1 Bird Dog, a little single-engine Cessna. And so we're listening to this search and rescue now mission going on, and the Raven overhead said to the C-130, the Airborne Command and Control Center, he said to Cricket, that was their call sign, he's down, he's injured, he can't get out of his airplane. And then we hear their enemy troops in the tree line shooting at his airplane. Then we hear he's been hit. We hear he's been hit again. He says he's not going to make it. He has classified information on board the airplane. Send in the fighters and bomb his airplane. And as I said in the book, he was my age for the last time that day. So that was day 3. Raven FAC was killed, being shot down in northern Laos. On day 4, we're in other briefings. We hear we've got a speaker system comes on again. We've got a damaged F-4 that's taken battle damage out over Laos. He's got hydraulic problems, and he's coming in gear up. So this airplane lands on the runway gear up, screeches to a halt, the canopies pop open, the 2 pilots jump out of the airplane and take off running, and the airplane burst into flames and burned on the runway. That's day 4. Day 5, we're in briefings. The speaker system comes on again. There's a Navy A-7 with battle damage inbound to NKP, and he got about 8 miles out, lost control of the airplane, and ejected. And he was picked up, and of course we all celebrated at the bar that night with the Navy guy. Day 6 was my first flight. So if you have any idea how scared I was, this day 3, day 4, day 5 of those briefings set the stage for what I was to expect for a year out over Laos.
Afraid you would be the topic on the next intercom.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to be the next guy or not.
Well, on day 6, took a month or so to become an old guy. Is that?
Yeah, we had really good pilots in the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron, and I got to fly with a couple of the old guys initially. They took us. It's a 2-seat airplane, and so I would fly with an instructor in the back seat. And we'd go out, and he would then show me around the area that I was going to fly as a forward air controller for most of my time there at NKP. And he would show me some of the targets that were out there that had been bombed and bombed and bombed, and they still started piling fresh bushes on them so that you would come in, and they used them as flak traps so that if a new guy might go out and find this target and think it's a good target and bring in fighters and waste bombs on a burned out truck that was covered with new bushes. So the guys would show me these things so I could mark them on my map and make sure that I did not do that. So I went out every day over Laos and then learned to spot my own good targets. And it took about a month to really get a good feel for the area that I was flying over, the AAA that came up every day, and so I felt like after 30 days I was an old guy. I could have taught the class. I had lived it by then.
Yeah. Well, and then you talked about the arc light with the B-52s. And,
yeah, that's an interesting story.
I'd like to hear that one.
Well, an arc light, by definition, was 3 B-52s, each carrying 108 500-pound bombs. They were precision. They were a real precision weapon. And what would happen is we would have this big area of Laos that we were responsible for. And every day we would brief for a couple of hours prior to going out. And part of our briefing was pre-planned missions. And one of the pre-planned missions frequently was an arc light was going to come into my area. Mm-hmm. And an arc light being 3 B-52s with a designated target of some maybe suspected storage area or part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that they wanted to blow away. But they would come in at a designated time, designated altitude, and we were told then to stay 5 miles away.
Because the blast was so powerful.
Well, it's just, just in case there's a stray bomb, just in case they miss their target. I never saw them miss their target, by the way. But what we would do is we would get 4 or 5 miles away. I could see the contrails on the B-52s, and I could see when they dropped, and they would turn to go back to home base. And then I would go up after all the bombs had exploded and look for any kind of secondary explosions. If they had hit something and caused some damage, I could tell that they either destroyed the road that they were trying to destroy or that they hit a storage area and things were on fire. So I'd go up and do what was called BDA, bomb damage assessment. So we would stay about 5 miles away from that until they had dropped, and then I'd go up and do bomb damage assessment. But there was this one day where it was a beautiful, clear day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and I was just doing my job and happy and flying along, minding my own business. And they had diverted an arc light from a primary target to a secondary target for some reason. And normally, and I say in the book always, we got a call on guard. The guard was the emergency frequency. And the call would say, avoid X-ray Delta 455, 455, coordinates on our map. Avoid this area by 5 nautical miles from this time to this time. So normally, and I say always, we were told that they were coming. That particular day, they did not make that call on guard. They did not tell me he was coming to a secondary target in my area. So I'm flying along in my beautiful OV-10, and all of a sudden it goes out of control. I have no control of the airplane. I flipped upside down. I was, I had no idea what was going on. Not a cloud in the sky, and I am now along for a ride. And it took several seconds for me to recover the airplane. And I was really frightened. I thought I'd been shot at and hit by maybe a 100 millimeter AAA piece from across the border in North Vietnam, which wasn't very far from me. And so I'm starting to look around for battle damage, and I'm getting back in control of the airplane. and I hear noises. And the OV-10 is a very loud airplane with these turboprop engines. And so these are noises that I wasn't accustomed to hearing. And I started looking around, and there were bombs going off on the ground in front of me, on either side of me, behind me. So I had just flown through 324 500-pound bombs that had just been dropped from 35,000 feet by 3 B-52s.
And how high?
And not a one of them hit me. But they disrupted the air so that my airplane had no stable air mass to fly through. That's why it went out of control. I was at 6,000 feet above ground level when this happened. I didn't lose a lot of altitude, but that's the day that I came back and I said, if you're on the list, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you're not on the list, there's nothing you can do about that either. And I was not on the list that day, because one of those bombs hitting my airplane, it would have detonated and I would have been history. So I flew through 324 500-pound bombs.
And lived to tell about it.
And lived to tell about it.
There's a not an acronym, but a nail. You talking about a nail and a hammer.
Our call sign in the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron was NAIL. So I was NAIL 27. That was my call sign every day when I went out to fly. I was NAIL 27. The squadron had a tradition of giving you a hammer. If you were going to be a nail, you had to have a hammer. So on day one, when I arrived in theater, they always welcomed the new guy at the bar, and our bar was called the Nail Hole. So there was a little platform in the bar, and the new guy would come into the squadron, and they would put you up on the platform and have you tell your story for 3 or 4 minutes. You know, I'm from Alabama, I graduated from Auburn University, went to pilot training at Craig Air Force Base, so forth and so on. And this is why I'm happy to be here. And then you drank the hammer. The hammer was a glass about this size with about 10 ounces of vodka and 2 ounces of green creme de menthe. No ice. And you were expected to chug it, put the glass on your head to show that there's nothing left in the glass, and then enjoy the evening. Well, the evening faded fairly quickly after drinking a hammer. So I've told that story and said, you know, you only want to do that one time in your life.
Unfortunately, only one time was required.
No, only one time was required.
What was the O2 then? There was was that the aircraft for the?
There were three forward air control airplanes that we used in Vietnam. The O1 Bird Dog was a single engine Cessna. The O2 was actually a Cessna 337. It's what they call the push-pull. It had an engine in front and an engine behind the cockpit. And it was a twin engine Cessna that wasn't aerobatic, and it wasn't nearly as fast as the OV-10, but it was used for forward air control, and we had a group in our squadron that flew O2s and a group that flew OV-10s. And the O2 guys primarily flew at night because we weren't allowed to fly at night, mostly because of the light reflection from our bubble canopy. It really caused distraction at night. So we flew virtually all daytime missions, and the O2s flew at night. And they would fly with and that was a side-by-side airplane, and there would be a pilot in the left seat and sometimes just a navigator, sometimes another pilot in the right seat, and the guy in the right seat had a starlight scope where he could see activity on the ground at night through his scope.
Because that's what he's there for, was to
Right.
Yeah, okay. You said that there was, you all used to do hot bunking. You'd have the O2s and,
Well, at Quang Tree during Lamson 719, amazing fiasco, I guess. But yeah, I had a bunkmate that would sleep in my bed in the daytime, and I slept in my bed at night. And even when I got there, that operation had been going for a couple of weeks. So the sheets on the bed never were changed. We would turn them over every now and then, but they were brown on both sides. It didn't matter. You slept when you could, and you
flew when you had to.
flew when you came out on the schedule.
Well, talk a little bit about that Lamson.
Lamson 719. A bunch of the Vietnamese generals decided that they were going to invade eastern Laos and try to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single highway, as you know. It was a series of roads that came out of North Vietnam, went through Laos, went through Cambodia, went into South Vietnam and resupplied their troops. And there were hundreds of these route structures down through Laos. And so the South Vietnamese decided that they were going to invade Laos and cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had no idea how many North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao soldiers were out there. They had no idea. And I compare it to a wounded cricket in Alabama being put on a fire ant bed. You stir up the fire ants and you put that wounded cricket there, and he doesn't last very long. When they invaded Laos, North Vietnam sent in additional troops, and it was a mess for 2 months. But now we were tasked to support the army. Our army supported the South Vietnamese troops with helicopter support. And so the South Vietnamese were flying helicopters, our army were flying helicopters. And in a 2-month period, there were 800 helicopters combined shot down in Laos. 800. Some of the guys that I met at Quang Tree that were helicopter pilots that were stationed on the other side of the field in their tent city had been shot down 4 and 5 times. And these guys were 18, 19 years old, and just, I don't know if they were totally insane or the bravest men I'd ever known. But they would get shot down, picked up, and they could go back out the next day and do it again. Our job was to support them in their missions. And all of a sudden, for that period of time, my area, which was called a high threat area in Laos based on the AAA threat, anti-aircraft artillery threat, we were told by our rules of engagement that we had to stay above 6,000 feet above ground level every day. And all of a sudden, when Lamson 719 started, there were no altitude restrictions. They lifted them all. So now we were flying low altitude with the helicopters, escorting them to targets. And it was a completely different environment. You can see a bullet coming, a tracer coming at you from 6,000 feet away, and you may have time to move. But at low altitude, you don't have time to move. So it made it a lot more interesting.
Interesting. So you were talking about the strategy for protecting a group that was of ARVNs or of South Vietnamese forces that were at the top of this mountain, and there were like NVA coming in from all directions.
Yeah, one of the missions that I flew, I had the first mission of the day, so I was on station at sunrise, and there was about a 500 foot high, I'll call it a mountain, What had happened was the Air Force had come in, and the C-130s would drop a 15,000 pound bomb with a fuse extender on the front of the bomb. So when it hit, it went off above ground level, maybe 10 feet, and it would clear a site for a couple of 100 yards. It would just completely annihilate all the brush in the trees. So the South Vietnamese Army guys had set up a camp on top of this 500-foot mountain after it had been cleared, and they were operating from that location. Well, when I got there that day, they were screaming for help. The North Vietnamese had surrounded the mountain, and they were coming up from all sides, and the South Vietnamese soldiers just weren't equipped to handle that volume of enemy fire. So it was my job then to try to rescue them. And that was the day I learned how dedicated the North Vietnamese soldiers were. You know, I guess, you know, they were going to get killed in war or not in war if they didn't do their job. I don't know what made them that dedicated, but I was able to call for air support, and I actually called in another OV-10, and I had him on the west side of the mountain. I was on the east side of the mountain. I would have 6 sets of fighters stacked above me, and I would have them running in as fast as I could get them, dropping every kind of ordnance we had. And so on my side, I was having them run south to north, breaking to the east, and on the other side, the other forward air controller was having them run north to south, breaking to the west, so that we were deconflicted. We were dropping munitions constantly, all morning, and we could not stop the North Vietnamese from getting to the top of the mountain. We dropped CBU, cluster bombs. We actually called in arc lights and had them try to drop the B-52s, dropping 324 bombs north and south of the target, trying to stop the influx of soldiers. That night I found out that all of the South Vietnamese soldiers had been killed. All of them. And my job the next day, I was first on station again, was to destroy the top of the mountain. And it was a very, very sad day for me.
You said about 900 had been killed?
I don't know how many were there. And I said in my chapter that during Lam Son 719, I'm not absolutely sure how many South Vietnamese were killed, but I think it was close to 9,000.
Oh, 9,000.
9,000 soldiers that went into Laos were killed in 2 months. And 800 helicopters, combined U.S. Army and South Vietnamese helicopters, were shot down in that small little box that we were in, which was the same area that I worked my whole year. It was like a fire ant bed. It was amazing, the dedication that the North Vietnamese had to keep that place alive in their territory.
You sound like it had a tremendous personal impact on your life.
Well, that was a very, very sad day. When you do every single thing you can possibly think of to do and you still lose, that's a statement. And I didn't like that at all. The next day, when I went out, I had my binoculars with me. I looked down, and it was like seeing a bunch of brown ants running all over the mountaintop. It was North Vietnamese soldiers scavenging everything that was left behind by the South Vietnamese. So I don't know how many I killed that day. I would say 100 to 200 I killed. I marked the target, and the fighters came in and dropped bombs and CBU and all that stuff. But we killed quite a few North Vietnamese, but that was not a win for us. That was a loss.
Now there was one story about when you said you left with much less fuel than you should have. Just, you want to get into some detail on that one?
Well, yeah, sure. Again, it was a day where during Lamson 719, I was flying out of Quang Tri. It was about I don't know, maybe just 30-minute flight from Quang Tri to my area. And I'd been out there working with the Army, and we had a troops in contact situation that popped up. And so I had fighters on station, and my replacement was due, but he was late. I don't know why, it didn't matter. But we had what we called our bingo fuel. And bingo meant leave.
Now.
Yeah, bingo's something you set and you don't very often mess with it. So it gives you a buffer, but it means go home. You hit bingo, go home. Well, that day I hit bingo, and I'm still waiting for my replacement, and he's still 15 minutes out. It's a beautifully clear day, and I know I'm going to be landing after dark. But Quang Tri is open, wide open. There's no weather, so I decided to change my bingo. This is how pilots learn lessons.
The learning curve gets pretty steep.
Yeah. So I won't say what I changed it to, because this is another term. But anyway, I left below my normal bingo about 15 minutes after I should have, thinking I'm going to get back to Quang Tri, just fly in. They would give us what was called a remote ground control radar approach until we had the field in sight. But on a good clear day, you could have the field in sight pretty easily because the runway's illuminated, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that particular day, being what it was, Murphy's Law and all those things, I've reset my bingo, so I arrive now without any reserve. And Quang Tri had come under rocket attack, and they had hit a generator with a rocket that had knocked out all the runway lights, all the lighting on the base. So the base was completely a black hole. And all of a sudden, the radar controller, which was an Army guy 10 miles from Quang Tri, so it was a remote ground control radar site, which didn't have a good reputation for accuracy, for getting you down on the runway in weather. Now they're telling us to divert to other bases. And there were several bases around that we could fly to, but in my case, I had screwed up. I had changed my bingo, and I had no divert fuel. I didn't have any reserve. I had to land at Quang Tri, and there were no lights. It was a black hole. And so, yeah, I was a little nervous. And I, pilots try to sound really good on the radio, and they said Nail 27. They finally come up. It's my turn. They say, Nail 27, where are you going? Where would you like to divert? And I said, I have no divert fuel. I am emergency fuel. Pilots sometimes call that emergency fool. I have emergency fuel. I have to land at Quang Tri. And the guy tried to convince me that I couldn't, telling me that there were no runway lights. And this was a small 3,000-foot strip made of perforated steel. So it was only 60 feet wide and 3,000 feet long. No overruns. It was the difficult runway, not for an OV-10. We could do pretty well on it, but certainly at night, you're trying to hit a toothpick, And so I said, I have to land at Quang Tri. I said, I've got enough fuel to either find the runway and land, or to go out east about 8 miles to the ocean and bail out. That's all I got. And so about that time, another voice came on the radio. And this was a much deeper, more sincere, professional voice. And he said, my call sign then was Hammer 271. Hammer 271, descend and maintain 2,000 feet, turn right heading so-and-so. And so he gets me on the GCA, the ground control approach. And basically you're coming in on a glide path, and he's giving you corrections either laterally or vertically. And he has a line on his scope, and he's trying to keep you on that line. Well, the airplane is really stable. It's easy to do that. So I'm all trimmed up, and I'm coming down, and it's on glide path, on course, on glide path, on course, on glide path. The next thing he says is over landing threshold, take over visually if possible. And the only thing I could say was negative, because I didn't have the runway in sight. I was over the runway, but I didn't have it in sight. I mean, I was supposedly, according to his scope, over the runway. So I said negative. So he just continued on course, on glide path, on course, on glide path. And the next thing I saw was the white stripe on the middle of the runway. The OV-10 is a power on approach, and you bring it down to the runway and you get close and pull the power back and land. Well, I had no idea how high I was because I had no depth perception. So I started pulling the power back, and when I did, I dropped it in from about 10 feet up. And it's a good thing it has good stress gear, 800 feet per minute stress on them, because I hit the runway pretty hard and I bounced several times, and I finally went to reverse thrust and I came to a stop. I had no idea how far down the runway I had landed. And I came to a stop on the runway and then had to figure out how to get off of it. So I was very lucky that night, very, very lucky. I had a good controller. I landed on the runway, and had I missed the runway, there were 800 helicopters on one side and a squadron of OV-10s and O-2s in bunkers on the other side, so I would have been in deep trouble.
You said normally you drop it in from 6 inches instead of 10 feet. Huh?
Yeah, normally you drop it in from 6 inches. I dropped it in from about 10 feet. And that's when the squadron commander came up on the radio and said, "What the hell are you doing landing at Quang Tri?" And I said, "Sir, we'll discuss that when I get in the squadron." So that's another story for another time.
So talk a little bit about the rest of your tour then in Vietnam.
I flew over the same area the entire year. I flew over Laos. My area was probably, 30 or 40 miles by 30 or 40 miles. It was a large area. Route 9 came out of South Vietnam and went into Laos and went out to Chapon in Laos. And just north of Route 9 was the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. My area covered several miles south of the DMZ and then several miles north of the DMZ along the North Vietnamese border. And my job every day was to go out and find trucks, bulldozers, troops, storage, petroleum, oil, POL sites, anything that was a target of interest. And there were lots of them. We didn't have too much trouble. Gun sites. We attacked gun sites whenever we could find them. Yeah. So for the entire year, I flew over that one area. But I flew for about 5.5 months out of NKP, Thailand. I flew for a month out of Quang Tri. And then I flew for another 5.5 months out of Da Nang, South Vietnam. So I was a Covey FAC. Their call sign out of the 20th Tactical Air Support Squadron was Covey. Okay. So I was a nail at NKP, I was a hammer at Quang Tri, and I was a Covey at Da Nang. But I was 2-7, 271, 271. So I kept the same 2-7 designation for the entire year.
So then you rotated back to...
Yeah, it was a 1-year tour, and I managed to get through it. I was a different person. when my part of the war ended, I was fired up, ready to stay. I volunteered to stay, but the drawdown was in effect, and that wasn't going to happen. That's what I found out when I tried to get my next assignment.
Because you volunteered for the Phantom F4.
Yeah, I told them, I'm a bachelor. I don't have a family to worry about. I can do anything you want me to do. Send me back. I would love to fly the F4 and come back on a consecutive mission. And they laughed and said, not going to happen.
Okay. So then you talk about like your reassignment then when you came back.
Well, early in the chapter, I talked about, I joined the Air Force to see the world, and where did they send me to pilot training? 100 miles from home in Alabama. So I went to Craig Air Force Base in Selma, Alabama, 100 miles from my house.
When you got back?
Well, but that was for pilot training.
Oh, I see.
So then I volunteered to go to Vietnam to get the hell out of Alabama, and they sent me to Vietnam. Well, so now it's time to come back, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot, but they said that's not going to happen. You're either going to go fly a B-52, which I had no interest in, a KC-135 tanker, which I had no interest in, or you're going to be an instructor in Air Training Command, flying a T-37 or a T-38. Well, I had no interest in being a T-37 instructor, but I loved the T-38. That was a fun airplane to fly, and we flew it in pilot training. It was our last half of our pilot training.
Is that what the T designation is?
Yes, a trainer. Yeah. Okay. And so I said, when he gave me those 4 options, well, I'll take a T-38. And he laughed and said, that's what everybody says when I give them those 4 choices. Well, I thought for just a second, and I said, well, is everybody willing to go to Craig Air Force Base to fly a T-38? And he said, no. You've got it. So that's how I got to be a T-38 instructor. I volunteered to go back to Alabama from Vietnam.
Can't shake it. It's like gum on your shoe.
Yeah, join the Air Force to see the world, and you spend the first, it was 5.5 of my first 7 years were in Alabama. I was at Craig Air Force Base from 1972 to 1976. It was time to be reassigned, and there were no airplanes. I reached that point in my career where now the word was called rated supplement or career broadening assignments. That's how they classified them to make them more palatable, but they stunk. So I'm either going to go be a personnel officer or a maintenance officer or a whatever. And I had resigned myself to the fact that I wasn't going to get out, that I love the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And so I had actually gone down to San Antonio, Texas, to Randolph Air Force Base, looked at my choices. I had my dream sheet, they called it, in the system, saying that my first choice was to go be a maintenance officer on a flight line to stay close to airplanes. So I thought they would assign me as a maintenance officer. My second choice was to be a personnel officer and do assignments and so forth. That didn't happen. I forget what my third choice was, but all those choices were not things we really wanted to do. It's what we were going to have to do for a while. But I got a call one day from this major who said, you've been assigned as an accession to me and Palace NAF. All their programs at Randolph are called Palaces, and NAF stood for non-appropriated funds. I had no idea what this guy's talking about. I'm a captain, I'm a pilot. I don't know any of this stuff. So he said, you're coming to me as a new accession, and you're going to go to the officers' open mess career field. I said, is that anything like being a club officer? And he said, yes, exactly. And I said, please put me on your non-volunteer list. And he said, I will, along with everybody else. We have no volunteers. Every Air Force base at the time, every military base had an officers club, an NCO club. And the clubs were our hangouts, and the clubs rarely were profitable because they were supplemented by the services to keep them in business. It was a horrific job. The club officer had to try to make all of his members happy, and that included wives, and that included junior officers, and so forth. So, next thing I know, I am at Keesler Air Force Base going through open mess management school for 6 weeks.
As a non-volunteer.
As a non-volunteer. And what I did do that I thought was smart was, after I gave in and realized this is fact, I don't have a choice. My choice is to get out and not have a job. I looked at the choices he gave me of bases. He said, you're either going to Shaw Air Force Base, Sumter, South Carolina, Pope Air Force Base in North Carolina. There was a small Air Force station in Montgomery, not Maxwell, but anyway, another place, and Myrtle Beach. Well, I knew that Myrtle Beach was going to get the A-10, my favorite airplane. So I thought, well, at least if I go to Myrtle Beach, I can meet A-10 pilots and maybe get an inroad into the airplane, because that's what I really wanted to fly. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to be an attack pilot, and this airplane had just become the new. It came in the service in the mid-70s, and the first operational squadron happened in 1977. So I went to Myrtle Beach in 1976, and anyway, I'm now a club officer at Myrtle Beach.
With your eyes on getting back in the
hoping
seat.
to survive the job. 50% of all the club officers in the Air Force were fired every year. And because there's not a pile of them sitting out there waiting, there are no volunteers to do the job. It's a terrible job. What happens is a colonel from one base will talk to his buddy at another base, and they'll both agree that they don't like their current club officers, so they'll swap. So they fire two guys and they just change bases. Well, I expected that to happen to me, but anyway, I went in, I did what the club school taught me to do. The Myrtle Beach Club became profitable. I survived the tour. I worked 60 and 70-hour weeks to make that happen. I worked harder there than I had ever worked as a pilot, I think. But I turned the club around, and it became a very profitable club. And in fact, about 6 months after I left that club, it was voted, nominated and selected as the best club in Tactical Air Command. So I didn't get the award. It went to my successor, but I felt like it was something that had happened on my watch, so I enjoyed it.
Says a lot about your determination, too.
Well, I had to survive. It's survival skills, I guess.
Or how do you get out of that club setting and stuff? And
You want which story do you want? You want the real one, or you want?
yeah.
Well, okay, I'm going to give you the real story. I'm close to 2 years into a 3-year assignment at the club, and I had gone to work at 7 o'clock one morning. It's just a midweek morning, and I got home about 5. So it was a slow day. But I'm tired, and I get home and I decided to just sit in a soothing bath and calm down from the day. And the phone rang, and it was my manager at the club saying, "We have a problem." So I got dressed and went back. The wing commander's wife had come in as the dining room had been set up, and she was going to bring a three-star general's wife to dinner that night. Well, that's a big deal for the wing commander to have a visitor on base who is his boss, a three-star general from 9th Air Force. And so the wing commander's wife had told my staff that she didn't like the color of the tablecloths in the dining room, and she wanted them changed. So my staff called me and said, "What do we do?" I said, "I'll be there shortly." So I got dressed, went back to the club, looked around, talked to my waitresses and said, "We've already got people seated, so change out all of the tables that are not in use now, and then when anybody leaves, change theirs, and let's go from the blue tablecloths that are on there now to the yellow tablecloths that the wing commander's wife likes." And I then walked into my office and I closed my door and I kicked a hole in the wall. It was fake wood panel wall. And I kicked a hole in the wall and I said, "I've had it. This is enough." And so I stayed. The wing commander's wife came in. I said hi. I mean, we knew each other very, very well. And I said, "Ma'am, everything okay with you?" And she said, "Oh, it's beautiful, Bill. Way to go. Thank you very much. I appreciate all your help." And the next day I went to my boss and I requested 30 days of leave. Well, it is rare, rare, rare. Although you're given 30 days a year, rarely does anybody get authorized to take 30 days. But I sort of explained to him what was going on. And I said, "I'm at a turning point in my career. I think I'm going to get out. If I can't get my assignment changed, then I'm going to just get out. I've had it. This is enough. I'm tired of working for wives and lieutenants." And I was a captain. But I had to make the wives and lieutenants happy in order to save my job. And so I took 30 days of leave and I went looking for a job on the outside. And there were none available. The Guard wasn't hiring. This is during the fuel crisis in the 70s. The Guard wasn't hiring. The reserves weren't hiring. And so I got in my car and drove to San Antonio, Texas. And I walked into the office of the major who assigned me to the club. And I said, "I quit." And he said, "What? You can't do that."
I haven't fired you yet.
That's right. And I said, "I'll do anything you want me to, except be a club officer. You've got non-appropriated funds offices, MWR, all these other things. I'll do anything you want." And he thought about it for a minute. And he said, "You're serious?" He said, "You drove all the way from Alabama or from South Carolina to Texas to tell me this, didn't you?" I said, "I did." He said, "Okay, I'll come up with a solution." He said, "Call me tomorrow." So the next day he told me he had another accession coming in, a graduate of Auburn University, where I went to school. He said, if I don't have to send him to club officer school, and if you will stay with him for 6 months and train him, I will let him take over your job." I said, "Yes, sir." And I walked out, and about a month later, I get a second lieutenant, brand new out of ROTC, reports into Myrtle Beach, and I spent 6 months training him, and he took over the club. And in the meantime, the wing commander, who really liked what I had done, helped me get an A-10 assignment.
What was that? What was the A-10 assignment? And after that?
Well, the A-10 had just come into the active service and was the first operational airplane was at Myrtle Beach. The first wing was to be at Myrtle Beach. He found out that he couldn't just give me an A-10. He didn't own me. I was owned by other people. So what he did was he asked them to put me in a particular month block where there were several airplanes, and then I got to compete for an airplane. And of course the A-10 was my first choice, only choice, and I competed well enough to get one and be assigned at Myrtle Beach. So I went from being a club officer at Myrtle Beach to being an A-10 pilot at Myrtle Beach. And the wing commander called me in his office and said, "Don't let me down." He said, "I'm taking a lot of grief for giving you the opportunity to fly the A-10 when some of my A-7 pilots aren't getting to convert to the A-10. So don't let me down." "Yes, sir." So I was actually top gun of my A-10 class, so I didn't let him down.
That's awesome. So after Myrtle Beach, you left Myrtle Beach after what, 4.5 years?
Well, yeah, I was there as a club officer for 2.5, and I was there as an A-10 pilot for 2. And then England Air Force Base in Louisiana was the next A-7 base. The A-10 was taking the place of the A-7. The A-7 was being taken out of the inventory. And so the A-10 was its replacement. So they had a conversion program where they selected a certain number of pilots in each wing to convert to this airplane. Well, the England Air Force Base was the next to convert, and I just happened to have worked hard again at Myrtle Beach. I became an expert in the training world. Fighter pilots have several different programs they have to live by. One is the training syllabus that tells you everything you have to do to stay current, get mission ready, and stay combat current and all those things. Well, I had become an expert with what I call 5150. That was the Air Force manual that directed all of our training. So when the conversion lieutenant colonel was selected to go to England Air Force Base, and I'll call it Alex because it was in Alexandria, Louisiana, and everybody called England Air Force Base Alex. When I was selected to go to Alex, it was because he picked me to be the new training officer in charge of the conversion at Alex. He picked another guy to be his Stanival guy, and another guy to be his weapons guy, and another guy to be, and a couple other guys to be just line instructors. And so I was selected as what was called the initial cadre to go to England Air Force Base. So I got a back-to-back operational A-10 assignment, which was hard to get, and I was thrilled.
So you're in a little piece of heaven.
I am in a big piece of heaven because my objective in life after Vietnam had become to be a fighter pilot, and now I was flying the airplane of my dreams, and I'd gotten good at it. I was an instructor now. I was fully qualified in all aspects of the A-10 after 2 years at Myrtle Beach, and now I was going to be one of the key instructors to convert A-7 guys to the A-10 at England Air Force Base, and that was a challenge, but also a lot of fun. When I went to England Air Force Base, these are all fully qualified fighter pilots, but we have to get them now up to speed in the A-10. So they go off to A-10 school, they come back, and then it was our job to get them mission ready.
Was this the group of the Flying Tigers?
Yes.
Okay.
You see the shark's teeth on the airplane.
Yeah, tell me about that.
I will. Interesting story, because being a member of the Flying Tigers for nearly 7 years, I got to meet many of the original Flying Tigers. Guys like Tex Hill and Ed Rector and Flash Segura and some of these guys that were AVG, the American Volunteer Group in Burma in World War II, flying the P-40s. They were the original Flying Tigers, and how they got their name was they're helping the Chinese fight the Japanese out of Burma, and they were flying P-40s, and a lot of the guys had heard that the Japanese had an innate fear of sharks, and so some of the crew chiefs, they're always talented people out there, and these crew chiefs got together and designed shark's teeth to put on the P-40s. Well, the Chinese weren't familiar with a shark, but they were familiar with tigers. And so when they started flying these airplanes with the shark's teeth on them, the Chinese started calling them the Flying Tigers. And that's how they got their name. So they aren't tiger teeth, they're shark's teeth, but the Chinese named them the Flying Tigers. And they did a marvelous job in Burma, and that heritage came back when the war ended. The airplanes came back painted, and as the years went by and they converted from these prop airplanes to now F-105s and whatever, the F-series airplanes, every time the 23rd Fighter Wing got a different airplane, it was authorized to paint the shark's teeth on the nose.
Because of the tradition of the outfit.
And it turns out that it was then, at the time, the only airplane in Tactical Air Command, which is now Air Combat Command, that's allowed to has nose art because of the heritage of the Flying Tigers. And so when it went from the P-40 to whatever was next, to F-105s, to there may have even been F-4s, and then A-7s, and then the A-10 is now today's Flying Tiger airplane.
So it's quite a tradition.
That's an amazing tradition.
And you
yes.
felt pretty honored to be
I loved the heritage of the 23rd Wing. It just becomes part of your blood. And being a Flying Tiger was very, very special. And I was a Flying Tiger for nearly 7 years. I was a flight commander, I was an assistant ops officer, an operations officer, I was a squadron commander, and then I was the assistant director for operations of the 23rd Wing. So I got to do almost every job there. Pretty neat.
Life is good.
Life is good.
Glad you hung out during that club.
You know what? I've told many people, as bad a job as it was, I ended up getting a very, very good performance rating out of that job. And that OER, Officer Evaluation Report, as they used to be called, OPR, Officer Performance Report, as they are now called, or I don't even know what they're now called. It's been a long time. But it was a top rating, and it actually saved my career along the way, because I had people tell me, I can't believe that you got a 1 on a OER during the 1, 2, 3 OER period as a club officer. That's amazing. So it was an offsetter for other deficiencies that I had in my records, like no master's degree.
Says a lot about your intensity and your dedication.
Well, as I told the 3-star general in my interview when he said, you don't have a master's degree, what are you going to do about it? And I said, sir, I have a master's degree in business management. And he said, you don't have a master's degree. I've looked at your record. I said, sir, I was a club officer at Myrtle Beach for 2.5 years. I have a master's in business management.
Can't argue.
He said, nice try, Pitts. Okay. A huge part of my career memories. In 1981, I was at England Air Force Base, and the Air Force had they had competition for air-to-air airplanes every other year, but they had quit having air-to-ground competitions 17 years earlier. But in 1981, the generals in charge decided to have a worldwide gunnery meet for the air-to-ground world again. The last one had been in had been 17 years earlier. So we were told that we were going to put together a team. And I was selected to be one of the top 10 guys in the wing, just based on our record, our range record, our bombing, strafing records. We kept those up to date all the time. And so the wing weapons officer selected the top 10 guys in the wing to do this. And then we went out and competed for a week, and the top 5 became the top 5. So nothing changed during that week-long competition. And as a result of that, we chose our top 5 guys to be on the Gunsmoke team. Well, we had to compete, first of all, at 9th Air Force to win the opportunity to go to the big competition. So we had a competition at Myrtle Beach. We went into Myrtle Beach. It was held on Dare County Range. There was a 9th Air Force competition, and there were 5 units that participated there. We were flying primarily against the A-10s at Myrtle Beach. All of our old friends, because we had just come from there. Really good pilots. And, the short version is that we won. We won handily. We had 5 really good guys. One was a spare, but 4 competing, and really, really fine pilots and really close friends of mine even today. But I had the best gunnery week of my life. And I became the 9th Air Force Top Gun that week, winning 4 of the 6 awards that were given to a combined 20 pilots available to get 6 awards. I got 4 of them, but I had a good week. And so I was able to then tell the wing commander, who is now a 2-star general, once again, I didn't let you down. So that was a momentous happening in my career, and it followed me along and helped me out along the way as well.
Well, that competition then went on to the next stage, right?
We went to Nellis Air Force Base then, and there were 15 teams competing. And after the first couple of days, it was obvious there were only 2 teams that were really one of the 2 teams was gonna get the big prize, and that was us and the Buckley Air National Guard, and they were flying A-7s. The A-7 had a computerized bombing system. Ours was strictly manual, and we were competing really well with them. And there are a lot of reasons for not winning the overall award, but I've always sort of put it on myself, because the last day, the last mission, I was dropping what was called a 20-degree dive pop tactical pattern. We'd practice these things over and over and over. The A-10 is a slow enough airplane that our foul altitude was 200 feet lower than every other fighter. But by the book, by the rules, and even by the Gunsmoke rules, our foul altitude was 200 feet lower on this particular event. And there was an F-4 guy in the range tower who hadn't seen a lot of A-10s because we were fairly new. And I rolled in on my pass, and coming down the chute, he fouled me. He said foul to. And I had done nothing different than I had done 1,000 times before. And so I got back to the debrief. I pulled out my gun camera film. We reviewed it. And in fact, I did not foul. The gun camera film showed that I had pulled out, bottomed out 200 feet above foul altitude. Well, that was what the normal foul altitude was for everybody else. Mm-hmm. So I think that the range officer made a mistake looking at the wrong foul line. But by the rules for Gunsmoke, we weren't able to appeal based on gun camera film. There were no appeals for fouls.
It would have been nice to have instant replay.
Yeah, and I could show everybody that I didn't foul, but there were no appeals. So I had an 8-meter bomb, which would have given us about 115 points. We lost to the Buckley Guard by 39.5 points. So my bomb, in my mind, cost us the overall trophy. But we won every other trophy we could win while there, including top A-10 pilot, was number 4 in our flight, top maintenance team, top load team, top everything. We took every award except the overall operations award, and we really did that, but we just didn't take it home. we didn't come back with our heads hanging. We came back very proud of what we had accomplished, and I think everybody else was too.
Fabulous.
And then you asked the question earlier. So I now have been given an assignment to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base here in Tucson. I'm coming out to be the Assistant Director for Operations, or what would be now called the Deputy Ops Group Commander. And I'm supposed to have my household goods picked up in 4 days. And I get called to a senior officer emergency meeting one day. And so we report to the wing commander's conference room, and we're told that we've just been called up to deploy to Desert Shield. And so after the meeting, I walked out and went up to the wing commander, and I said, "Sir, you've only got 5 officers in this wing that have combat time and been shot at before. I'm one of them. You can't send me to Tucson. You need to send me to the war. I'm one of the guys who's been there before." He said, "You'd rather go to Saudi Arabia than to Tucson?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And so he stopped my household good assignment. I became the senior guy on the first airplane out as the advanced party for the deployment. I was in the position then to be the Director of Operations for 2 squadrons that deployed shortly thereafter. So when you watched Desert Storm on TV and you saw all the A-10s flying with their shark's teeth, those were my airplanes. And I didn't get to fight the war. My boss ended up replacing me after 3 months because I had the assignment here. But I thought the war was going to start when we got there. So I went with good intent. But I got to do the training that led up to the successes that came out of Desert Storm for the A-10. We went over there trained to fly airplanes at 100 feet and fight at 100 feet. And that's what we expected to do. When we got there, there had already been 3 or 4 aircraft crashes, all at low altitude. So General Horner had restricted everybody in their training leading up to the war to 500 feet. Well, when we started flying and training, I don't know if you've ever been to Saudi Arabia, but what a strange place. Once you take off and you get outside the site of your base, the desert it's just flat and brown for as far as the eye can see. Nothing. It's just nothingness. There's not a bush, there's not a tree. I could see a camel from 7 miles away. We eventually the 500-foot restriction was lifted. And so on the first day of training after that restriction was lifted, I scheduled myself to fly with one of the squadron commanders to go out and fly at low altitude to see how that would work. And it didn't. We found it to be, we didn't have radar altimeter in the A-10. I mean, the A-10 was just a basic pilot's airplane. So we had maps, and we did have inertial nav system finally, but there was just nothingness out there. And the wind would blow, and you couldn't see the horizon. There was no definable horizon because it was different shades of brown. And so as we tried to let down below 500 feet based on just eyeballing it, we would have hit the ground. There's no question in my mind. So after several tries on my part, unable to do it, several tries on his part, unable to do it, we came back and I actually drafted the requirement for the 2 squadrons that I was responsible for, that nobody would fly below 500 feet in an A-10 from the 23rd Wing. So there were a lot of angry pilots, angry at me for not allowing them to go do what they were trained to do. But starting that day, we had meetings where we determined that if we can't fly low, then we have to fly higher. So we decided that 5,000 feet was a minimum. We were going to have to fly above 5,000 feet to do our job. And then we started training there. But after a few days, I'm again out on a mission training, working with an Army unit. And it's a beautiful, clear day, not a cloud in the sky. And I can see the Army unit in their encampment. They had a few vehicles there. And there was an air liaison officer on the ground, ALO we call him. He's an Air Force pilot who's with the Army unit embedded. And he sees us, we're overhead and we're practicing actually attacks on his tanks. So we're training with our Maverick missiles and our gun sight and all this stuff, not dropping or hitting anything, but just training. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I just out of the blue, I said, we're going to climb up a little bit. Tell me when you can't hear us anymore. And when we got above 8,000 feet, he said, I can't hear you. Okay. Tell me when you can't see us anymore. When we got above 11,000 feet, he couldn't see us. So as big an airplane as the A-10 is, and is painted dark, he couldn't see it because we were now so small that his eyeball just couldn't focus on that dot.
And there was no sound to draw him towards that
So
location.
above 8,000, no noise. Above 11,000, no sight. We were invisible, except to radar. So we decided after that to start building our tactics for the war on this middle altitude employment. And if on day one we could knock out their radars and kill most of the radar missiles that we had located through satellite imagery and all those things, then the A-10 would have a pretty easy time of target acquisition and employment from above 11,000 feet. And so we developed the training tactics in theater that helped win that war. And the A-10 was a very powerful force in Desert Storm. About 65% of all the armor and vehicles that were killed by A-10s with the Gatling gun and the AGM-65 Maverick missiles.
It's called a tank buster, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I could, with my Maverick missile, which is a infrared imaging missile system, I could lock up a Camel from 7 miles away. I could lock up a tank, which was our primary target, from over 12 miles away. Now I couldn't shoot it that far because the missile won't go that far. But I could lock one up because I could see it in the missile head and or through the imaging in the cockpit.
Well, show me on the model there where you were talking about the Maverick missiles?
Yes. This is a Maverick missile. It is some have 100-pound warheads, some have a couple 100-pound warheads, different size missiles. Most of them weigh from, 600 to 800 pounds. Mm-hmm. We carried, this one only has 2 missiles on the airplane, but we had racks that we could put them on, and we could carry up to 6. And a load of other munitions. The A-10 would carry up to 16,000 pounds of wing-loaded munitions, along with it'll hold a maximum of 1,174 30-millimeter bullets, and it fires at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, which is 65 bullets per second. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to show you something. This is a 20-millimeter bullet that is fired by most of the fighters in the inventory. The F-16, the F-15E, the F-18s all fire 20 millimeter. Mm-hmm. This is a 25 millimeter that is currently to be fired out of F-35s. This is a bullet. This is the 30 millimeter that comes out 65 per second out of the Gatling gun on the A-10. The A-10 carries 3 different bullets. This is a dummy bullet, but this would be a target practice round. It just has a steel head.
Yeah.
It will kill anything it hits, pretty much, except it won't penetrate armor. And it also has a high explosive incendiary round, HEI round, that is like a little mini hand grenade. It has a delayed tip fusing so that it will actually penetrate a lightly armored vehicle or a truck and then explode, so it does maximum damage. And then there's a depleted uranium round that fits inside the cone of this, and depleted uranium is the densest material that we have, and when it hits a tank, for example, it melts its way through. It instantly, upon impact, heats up to 2,500 degrees, and it will melt its way through the armor and cause a spalling effect on the inside. So it makes a small hole on the outside and a much larger hole on the inside with nothing but molten metal.
So when you're in Desert Storm, that really, or Desert Shield.
Desert Shield, actually. I would love to be able to say I was in Desert Storm, but they brought me home. I had to come out to Tucson and watch the war on TV.
Yeah. So that was your next assignment then. After when you left there, you came back to
I came
Tucson.
here and I was the Deputy Ops Group Commander for 2 years.
Yeah. And then that's when you retired?
No, that's when I got the over-the-hill briefing.
The over-the-hill briefing.
Yeah. Hey, Colonel, come in my office. You've been flying airplanes too long. Long story, but I'll shorten it to just one sentence. I went through several different assignment options, some good, some not. I ended up being selected to be the Chief of Inspections for the Inspector General team for the Air Force Reserve at Warner Robins, Georgia. And about 6 months into my assignment there, the Inspector General actually retired. So I ended up being the Inspector General for the Air Force Reserve for a little over a year, along with the Team Chief for the Inspections Division. So I held down 2 positions, but I did that up until my retirement in 1994.
94. What was that like walking away finally?
Scary. I had found myself a home being an Air Force pilot. No 18-year-old kid well, can't say no. Few 18-year-old kids know who they want to be in life. And I certainly was one of those who did not know. But it was after Vietnam, and I say in the chapter, Vietnam was my destiny. I knew who I wanted to be, and I got to be that person. For nearly 26 years in the Air Force, I was an Air Force pilot. I got to be a fighter pilot. I got to be an A-10 guy where I picked up my call sign, Boss Hog, and I loved it. I treasured it. And in September of 1994, I was frightened because I had no idea who I was going to be.
You weren't going to be Boss Hog anymore.
No.
You found a job with UPS.
I did, and it's one of those, it's who you know. I had done what I thought was a decent job at Warner Robins, and my bosses liked me. So I was walking down the halls one day, and the Brigadier General Dave Sibley, another A-10 guy in the Air Force Reserve, passed me and said, "Hey Pitts, what are you going to do when you retire?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "Have you thought about UPS?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, come to my office, let's talk." So I went in and he said, "The guy in charge of hiring at UPS works for me in the reserves." I think you ought to put in an application. So I put in an application. And about a month goes by, and he passed me in the hall, and he said, "Hey, have you heard from UPS?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, come with me to my office." He picked up the phone, and he calls, and he gets the guy on the line and said, "You got bits in your computer yet?" "Yes, sir." "Why haven't you called him?" So the next day I got the phone call from HR at UPS saying, "We'd like to interview you." And so I went in for an interview and became what I call the old fart quota of my class. At age 45, I got hired by UPS. I've told my son is an F-35 pilot in today's Air Force. He's a lieutenant colonel at Luke Air Force Base. And as he was going through his career and having some of these same feelings, I just said, no matter what job they give you, you do the best job you can do at that job, and they'll give you a better one next time. And I think he's managed to do that as well.
So then in 94,
I got hired by UPS 6 weeks after I retired. And I flew for UPS in the back seat of the 727 for 7 years. But at the same time, my wife started a business, and I was helping her with the business. And she grew it into a monster. And I had to make a decision after 7 years at UPS to either hire somebody to take my place as what I would call me being the COO, CFO of our company. And don't get me wrong, she was the CEO. I worked for her.
her name was Ruth Ann.
And either hiring somebody to take my place or quitting UPS. And it was a tough decision to make because the UPS job was a very good job, very lucrative job, great benefits. But our company was important to us, and it had grown large at this point. So I decided to leave UPS, and I quit and stayed with her. We did the business for 15 years.
Tell me about Ruth Ann.
Beautiful lady, born and raised in Arizona. Her grandfather homesteaded in the Florence Coolidge area. She was born in Florence. She grew up in Casa Grande. She still has 2 brothers there. Arizona through and through. I met her in 1992. We were married in August of 93. She started her company in 1994. She grew it to 25 people in 5 states in the next 7 years, doing business primarily with the federal government. She went from an idea in 1994 to a $13.5 million company by the time we peaked. She was a real entrepreneur, probably the best salesperson you'd ever meet in your life. She could sell you anything. And our business was commercial office furniture and interior products, and she found the niche that most people did not want to find. She wanted to work with the government and do GSA, General Services Administration product. Most people thought it was too complicated, complex, and didn't want to work with the government. But she found out how to do it, and she did it very well.
Well, like we've just gone through the 9/11 event, the anniversary, and in 9/11, then there was a lot of scurrying going around trying to reposition people and operations and stuff, and she got involved with that in the furniture end, right?
Yes. We had an office in Norfolk, Virginia, and we had done business with a lot of government agencies around that part of the East Coast, and we had a good reputation. And so when 9/11 happened, there was an Army 4-star and all of his staff that had to be relocated right away to a temporary facility. So they needed office furniture immediately. Well, they had bought originally from a company out of Maryland, and this company was huge. and sort of callous with their customers. It's my personal opinion. And so they didn't enjoy the relationship that they had had with them. So when it came time for them to now buy new furniture for their new offices, they started looking around, and one of the guys said, "Hey, I did business with Simmons Contract Furnishings down in Norfolk, and they were great to work with." So they actually flew a helicopter down and picked up our team from Norfolk and flew them up, and we found the facility that they were going into. We measured it, specified the product that they were looking for, helped them pick all the colors. We had our design team out here working 24 hours straight because they needed furniture in 6 weeks. And this furniture product was built to order. So we had to specify it. It then had to be built and then shipped and then installed. That normally took 8 to 10 weeks to happen. The building process normally took that long. Our main manufacturer, however, went into their system and they prioritized this job as their number one job. They pulled product out of production for other companies around the country and gave it to us. And we had them up and running 6 weeks later in a brand new office space with a 4-star general and his entire staff. So we weren't, I don't know who was the first, but we were one of the first to be called to action after 9/11. So as I said in my chapter, you know, you can even be patriotic in the furniture business. So it was a big deal in our lives.
About it and responsive. And during that time too, you were the Luncho Buncho folks, all the pilots that got together out here in Tucson. When did you fall in with those guys?
Well, I had managed at one point back in the days at England Air Force Base. I worked for a guy who was then Colonel Jim Reckert. He went on to become a 3-star general, Lieutenant General Commander, 12th Air Force. I thoroughly enjoyed working for him. He was a wonderful boss and a great leader. As you can see, that he went up the ranks. After he retired, he went to work for Hughes, then Raytheon, but lived here in Tucson, and we became really close friends. And it's just an honor for a colonel to have a general as a close friend. He became what I would call my honorary brother. He had been invited to this group that called themselves the Luncho Buncho. And it started out with 3 or 4 guys at Rick's Cafe down here at, well, it may not have even been at Rick's Cafe initially, but it ended up being at Rick's Cafe at River and Campbell. Now Rick's is out of business. He invited me to lunch a couple of times. And I kept telling him, you know, I don't want to, this is your group, not my group. And I don't want to be with you so often that you get tired of me. So I'm going to let this be your group. And so I only went 2 or 3 times, but I really enjoyed the group. And as you can see in the book, the level of people in this group, we have one retired 4-star general. At any time in the Air Force, there are only 12 or 13 of those. We have 2 retired 3-star generals. We have 3 retired 2-star generals. 1 retired 1-star general who happens to be Jim McDivitt, the astronaut from the original astronauts, commander of Gemini 4 and Apollo 9. We have 3 colonels that were POWs in Vietnam. 1 for over 6, 1 for nearly 6, and 1 for just under 1. Just a whole bunch of really, really, really accomplished, good guys, with the common thread being we're pilots. Everybody in the group's a pilot. And so when the book idea came about, and I'd like to think I had something to do with that, because I came home one day after sitting next to General O'Laughlin and General McDivitt and listening to stories that they were telling, I came home and I told Ruth Ann that this is the most amazing group of guys I've ever been around, ever been associated with. Now, let me back up for a minute. General Record died of leukemia, and after his death, the group invited me to come to lunch, and I was really honored by that. I was the young guy for a long time. I'm not anymore, but I was the young guy in the group. Most of these guys are in their late 70s to now late 80s. But I was honored to be invited to sit down with these guys and just listen. And they even asked me stuff every now and then. But I listened to stories, and I came home one day and I was telling Ruth Ann about all these stories I was hearing, and she said, "Well, get off your butt and do something about it." Well, she had a master's in English, and she was a good writer, and I was sort of hoping she might volunteer, but she volunteered me. Well, what I did was I started thinking about it, and I went to Shep, General Shepard, because knowing he had authored 3 or 4 books before, and I simply said, these stories that we hear every Friday, the wives don't know them. The children don't know them. The grandchildren will never know them. Let's come up with something to collect some of these. And he said, well, I got an idea. So about 2 weeks later, he came in with the idea for the book. And he just said, everybody write a chapter.
And the book is called The Friday Pilots.
Yeah. It's now the group is not the Luncho Buncho, it's the Friday Pilots. So none of the chapters tie together. They're just, in our own words, our memories put together in only 15 or 16 pages. That's what we were, the book can't be huge, so we couldn't write a book. I had to build an outline, and I had to eliminate a whole bunch of stories that I would love to have told. But we were given the guidance of 15 to 16 type pages, and that's what most people did.
But it honors the individual memories of each person, and they are tied together with that fighter pilot Air Force connection. Mostly Air Force. Mostly Air Force. A couple of the guys were early Air Force and then went to the airline. Now we have a Marine pilot, we have a Navy pilot, we have other guys that have joined the group over the past few years, and some are actually younger than me. What kind of advice would you give someone considering going into the Air Force or just into the military at this point? Of course, you have a son that's a pilot. Yes, I do. I advised him that what I told him to do was to pick out 10 career fields that interested him before he ever went to college, and study them, and then make a decision, because at some point early in his college he needed to know who he wanted to be so he could work toward that goal. And he picked pilot as one of his choices, and he ended up getting a scholarship from both the Air Force and the Navy. And he actually took the Navy scholarship first, but we swapped him over to the Air Force, and now he's a F-35 pilot at Luke Air Force Base and just pinned on Lieutenant Colonel. So he's doing pretty good. Gosh, that's a tough question in today's world. However, I still think the military in any of our branches of service is a great place for a young man or woman to grow up, to get educated, to get a free career field handed to them, to learn maybe who they want to be, but they're also offered the opportunity at no cost to them to get their college degree. If they go in enlisted, they can eventually become an officer once they get a college education. But with a college education, if they want to be a pilot, it's a real challenge. You've got to start as a freshman in college. You can't just wait till your senior year,
like I did. I was fortunate that there was a war going on. They needed me. Today, it's totally competition. You think about it, fewer than 1,000 students from across the country are selected to go to Air Force pilot training every year. Fewer than 1,000 from every career, from every university, including the Air Force Academy. And half of those people normally come from the Air Force Academy. So then I would say it's fewer than 500 come from every other university in the country. So if you're not competitive, you're not going to even get the opportunity. Then when you go to pilot training, only 10% will ever be a fighter pilot. They pick the top of the class because it's multi-million-dollar airplanes, mostly single cockpit nowadays. So the best of the best get to be fighter pilots. And you're talking just unbelievable odds against you along the way. And the competition is just as keen as it ever can get.
So start early and work hard.
Start early, work hard, have a goal, have a plan to get to your goals, and you'll, to be a pilot of any kind in the military is an honor. It's patriotic. You'll never regret it. Although they ask you now to stay for many years, longer than they did when I joined. Even if you got out at the first opportunity, the airlines come after military pilots aggressively. So you can go from one good career field to another. The pay is good. It's much better than it used to be. I think when I was a second lieutenant, I made about $400 a month. Some of the Friday pilots talk about, 150 was a neat month for them. They're much older than me. But the pay is good now. I think there's a lot of things going on in the military that I don't care for. I hope change, but it's still a great career field. But you just, if you wait till the last minute, you can still get in. You probably can't be a pilot. If you want to be a pilot, you have to start competing as a freshman in college. You have to have that ambition and that goal, I think. But to get in the service and do anything is an honor. It's patriotic to the United States of America. Just one quick story. A friend of mine had a son who was at the Air Force Academy. My friend is a fighter pilot. His son was going to be a fighter pilot. That was his goal for his life. He broke his back in a skiing accident. But he graduated from the academy. He couldn't be a pilot because of his back situation. So he went into a communications career field. He got out after 5 or 6 years. And today he is a business executive with Microsoft and in charge of their communications security program. All started at the Air Force Academy, all started as a result of a back accident. He got all of his training in the Air Force, and then he went to Microsoft, and now he's a business exec making tons of money and enjoying it.
Things happen along the way.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anyone or any experience that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I want to say something about a friend of mine. And let me back up for a minute. We didn't discuss the fact that at the end of my chapter, and you may have to bear with me for.
Take your time. We're not in a hurry.
I'm still a little fragile, but my wife Ruth Ann, beautiful lady. Had a cycling accident 2 years ago and severe brain damage, and she died 6 days later. Which leads me to my good friend Eric Erickson. He joined our group after the book was written, and he had just moved to Tucson with his lovely wife Frida. They bought a house out in Rancho Vistoso, and Eric's heart quit one day while he was driving in Tucson. And he had only been to 5 or 6 of our lunches, but we had gotten to know him well enough that we really wanted a chapter in the book written by Eric. So I'm going to give you a very brief rundown. A warrior. This guy was a warrior. He did just as I did. He graduated from pilot training. He wanted an OV-10. He wanted to go to Vietnam and be a forward air controller. And he got that opportunity, and he went to NKP Thailand just like I did. And he flew the OV-10 just like I did. I did not get shot down. He did. He got shot down. He got shot up one day so badly that I've seen a picture of him standing in the nose well of the OV-10. The hole was that big where the AAA blew half the nose off the airplane. So just feet from where he was sitting, he took this tremendous hit with a 23 millimeter AAA piece. So I've got a picture of him standing in the nose of the airplane. And then about a week or so later, he actually got shot down. And he spent the night in the jungle, and they picked him up the next day. They thought he was dead, but they found him the next day and got him out. And he went on to, didn't stop, never even questioned, just kept flying. Volunteered then to be a Raven FAC. The Ravens were in a covert operation that we had with the CIA, and they would come out of being a forward air controller and they would volunteer to go into this program, and they had about a 50-50 chance of surviving. The Ravens got shot down all the time. They flew in very intense areas and did very dangerous missions, and they wore blue jeans and t-shirts and grew beards and long hair, and they never were associated with the military in any way. The airplanes were unmarked. But he volunteered to do that after having been shot down once and shot up many times in the OV-10. So he goes off to fly in his little O-1 Bird Dog now doing the Raven mission. And even there, he got shot up many times. In fact, his boss told him if he came back with another bullet hole in his airplane, he was going to be grounded. So Eric told the maintenance guys to quit telling the boss about his bullet holes. Just fix it. Just fix them. And so he ended up in a crash in an O-1 and survived that. Runway wasn't quite long enough for him that day. Just a warrior. And I have friends that flew with him that said he had the ultimate respect from all of the fighter guys that he worked with and all of the special forces guys that he worked with. He was truly a warrior. He liked it so much that after his 2 years, 1 year in the OV-10, 1 year in the Raven program, he volunteered to get out of the service and stay with the CIA and fly 2 years with Continental Air Service, doing CIA logistics missions in theater. And then after that, he hired on with Flying Tiger Airline that was eventually bought by FedEx, and retired as a FedEx captain after many years. And he was a great guy, lived in Alaska, had his own Cessna 185, flew around Alaska, supported the Iditarod, actually volunteered for a special mission down in Africa and went and flew support for needy families in Africa for 6 months. And just an amazing guy, and we all miss him. And he's on our webpage as an afterthought. He didn't get to write a chapter, but he's somebody that we all admire.
And love.
Yeah.
And love. Is there anything else? That'd be a good way to.
That'd probably be the best way to.
Let's just.
Best way to
end
end this
with Eric Erickson's
before I
memory and your wife's
yeah.
Ruth Ann's memory. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your stories and
Well, I want to thank you for your time in doing this. This is
and for your service. It's very much appreciated.
well, I enjoyed my service. I would do it again, but I'm too old. They won't have me anymore.
That's the good place to stop. Thank you.